My name is Nate Olson. I'm the interim director of the Kegley Institute of Ethics. It's wonderful to have you with us both in person, and I know we have many people on Zoom joining us on Zoom tonight as well. We will start tonight's event with CSUB's land acknowledgement. We acknowledge with gratitude that the meeting place of California State University Bakersfield is the traditional territory of the Kitahnamuk people of the Tohono tribe, a place their nation has called home since time immemorial. After the Tohono tribal leaders worked for over 15 years petitioning the federal government for recognition, the tribe finally received tribal reaffirmation in January 2012, which reaffirmed the tribe's status as a federally recognized sovereign Indian nation with an established government-to-government relationship with the United States of America. The land on which we gather today and its surrounding areas are still home to many Indigenous communities. We are grateful for all the Indigenous people who continue to care for and remain interconnected with this land. We promise to be conscientious stewards of this land for the future generations. Thank you. Tonight's lecture, as I mentioned, is the 37th Charles W. Kegley Memorial Lecture. Charles Kegley was the founding chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at CSUB. He was named Outstanding Professor in 1984 and later named a member of the CSUB Faculty Hall of Fame. He published many articles in both theoretical and applied ethics and in social and political philosophy. Dr. Kegley believed in the humanity's ability to illuminate real-world issues. The annual Memorial Lecture features speakers who do just that. Past speakers have included Angela Davis, Daniel Ellsberg, and Viet Thanh Nguyen. Tonight's speaker, Rebecca Nagle, continues in that tradition. I want to acknowledge those who've made tonight's event possible, including our event sponsors, Valley Strong Credit Union, the Kegley family, the Office of the Provost, and the Division of Equity, Inclusion, and Compliance. I also want to thank the Kegley Institute's fantastic staff member, Tricia Harmon, who many of you saw as you're signing in to the event tonight, and also Thomas McClendon, Mike Bohan, Frank Robinson, who are all in back, making sure that we've got the technology working here. So please give them all a round of applause. I also want to thank David Silva, who's up here on stage. David this year became CSUB's first ever tribal liaison. David has been a wonderful collaborator on planning for this event. And beyond that, this is an opportunity for us to thank David for all the work he's done over the last several years to raise awareness of Native Indigenous issues at CSUB and bring overdue recognition to our campus Native and Indigenous communities. That includes, just to name a few things, and I mean, in a short period of time here, founding the Native and Indigenous Student Coalition. He's currently co-chairing the Indigenous Faculty and Staff Association and working to establish CSUB's inaugural Native Indigenous commencement ceremony last spring. I know he's currently planning this year's commencement ceremony and a week of events leading up to Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Day. Thank you, David. I think all join. Thank you, David, here. And I want to invite David to the podium here to share a few words and introduce the Eagle Heart Drum Group. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Dr. Olson, for that glowing recommendation, which that's all very true, 100%. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. On behalf of myself, the Indigenous Faculty and Staff Association, the Division of Equity, Inclusion, and Compliance, and just overall the California State University Bakersfield campus, thank you for coming. So my name is David Silva. I'm the university's tribal liaison. I descend from the Tohono Nation, the Pascua Yaqui, and the Mayan tribe. Typically, when we do events like this in our culture, we'd like to welcome the event in our own language. So I will just provide a quick blessing in Yaqui. Amante te vote enchianavu. May our Creator bless you. And with that, I'd like to welcome today our very special guests, the Eagle Heart Drum Group and Singers. So these fine group of elders, youth from intertribal communities and our local community come together to provide healing, blessing, and we open these types of events in a good way where we welcome the Creator we bless the earth, and we are just thankful for being able to come together and provide this good energy for you. So with that, just please give them a round of applause for coming here. Okay, and Dr. Olson, right back to you. Oh, okay. Well, then with that, we are going to start off our ceremony in a good way. So please, with respect, just take it with your heart and minds, what we do. We're not professionals, but we are also professionals. Thank you.
That was a brass band song usually as they travel. Bless the ground when you set your village. Now we're gathering here. What we will do ceremony. what we need. I would say that Jesus is Lord. Ohio. Here, songs here were brought to us. They asked us to continue with these songs to keep it for healing broken walls, to help heal families. If they're having issues, we need to break down the walls, bring everybody back together. That's what we need a lot of these. But with the drum, that's what the prayer is for everybody to reconnect. I know as you're here, you're feeling the drum. These are our prayers. Share the song. You'll feel it. That's what we try to bring to you all, to share in the culture. Everybody's different. This is my family drum. This is Cherokee drum. These are my Cherokee brothers. These next couple of days, we have our Cherokee chief coming into town. And this would be a great lesson if Rebecca was here, but still, she's here with us in spirit. So we'll share that with the chief come Friday. And I think David's putting word out. If you're interested, more welcome to show up. We'll be in Veterans Hall more. Here for Rebecca, we'll do a woman.
Drumming, it takes a lot more than have practice. Really home when we're singing, because you're not just songs, the creators, there's lessons. So we're coming from our heart, it's coming from what we body, our spirit, we're channeling that to our. If anyone is ever interested, 501-40th, some class on Thursday. Almost everything. We can start at 6 p.m. and go to Number Voices, Never Hear. We're not really done with that. But basically, this is what you get to practice with that. Learn from the elders in our community about the culture, the stories they have, the songs that they were artists. You really experience something.
He does a lot of people, you know, north. You play all these songs that brought to us from folks coming in, work with kids, basically. This one, when she was dancing, she was the little one. That young lady who did part of it. That one there holds a high regard when you see it. He's doing the same for us. He is. We're singing for our ancestors. We have a ceremony coming up, which for the local folks here, we love to be involved in things like this. Help for the healings and for our families and everybody here. Has, like, especially with the COVID going around, it is hard. This was our main connection. I mean, if we weren't able to grab around the drum, we were able to connecting messages to let us know the drum is needed, not all of us. And this is how we were able to help each other get through these times. And that's what we like to share. More than welcome, like David said. If I'm not there, Mario's will be there. He's our own rep, tribal member, and he has a lot of songs that he shares. And like I said, it's very powerful to get around the drum and start to know some of the community. And then we all put together. Really uplifts you as a family. Get the family involved. If it's touching you, you know you got a little bit of heartbeat of blood in the sound more. With that, we're going to close that with one more song. This will be talking about with the heartbeat. This is the heartbeat song. Thank you for having us. We're here with the community, Bakersfield community, and Bakersfield Community Health Project. This is our spiritual healing. This is our spiritual health. Something that they can help share. If we're not there, there's a big group. We have sometimes we have to get 2 drums out, cover all of the members and drummers that we have, and we like to get the youth involved, which they sing better than we do. But as it is, you know, we want to keep them active. And same with Marcella, she's one of our teachers to get the ladies out. We used to have powwow here, up there on the phone right now, but Bakersfield, we've always been represented. That's where Eagle Heart moved from to prepare for the Bakersfield powwow. We worked on that for 18 years. You know, almost 10 years for, I guess, the last 10 years. But we need it in the valley where we share our messages. I was born here, even though my tribe, Cherokee people, were from both Carolina. Lord. My mother, she came this way with her tribe. It's better life. And that's what we all try to do, provide for us. Spiritual, medical. This has always helped someone more welcome to be part of it. And to network, because if you don't know who you are, likely within the neighborhood, this thing brings them out and you connect with people of your city, right? And that's what happens with us. And how the chief comes to see us each year. Really My name is Riley Crow Rose. From the board. But Tower John. We like to got talking out here. For products of Mother Earth. Arnett, let's do it. Thank you for having me. Thank you for having us all. Hope you got a little energy out of that.
Thank you so much to the Eagle Heart Drum Group. Give them another round of applause here. Thank you. That's fantastic. So as we're wrapping up here on stage, we're just really getting started here. It's my pleasure here to introduce tonight's speaker. I want to check, make sure we Rebecca, you're able to hear us there. Ms. Nagle is joining us on Zoom, as I mentioned tonight. Rebecca, you're able to hear, and we want to check, make sure we can hear you too. Okay, we're checking here and we should have this connected, so.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes, there we go. Thank you so
Okay.
much for wonderful. So we can hear you loud and clear in the theater here, and I think we can others can hear you on Zoom too. So thank you so much for being with us tonight, Rebecca. I'm going to introduce you here to our group on in the Dore Theater here, as well as on Zoom. So it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Rebecca Nagle is an award-winning journalist, citizen of Cherokee Nation, some of your fellow citizens here, as you heard on the stage tonight, and a two-spirit woman. She's the writer and host of the excellent podcast, This Land. Her writing on Native representation, federal Indian law, and tribal sovereignty has been featured in many news outlets, including The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The Guardian, USA Today, Indian Country Today, and more. The first season of This Land tells the story of a Supreme Court case about tribal land in Oklahoma, the small town murder that started it, and the surprising connection to her own family history. That story is the subject of her first book, which will be published later this year. Season 2 of her podcast is an expose of how special interests are using custody battles over Native children to attack tribal sovereignty in another case that made its way to the Supreme Court. Rebecca's received many awards for her work. That includes the American Mosaic Journalism Prize, which is the largest cash prize for journalism in the United States. She's also received the Exceptional Journalism Award from the Women's Media Center, a Peabody nomination, a National Magazine Awards finalist, 2 Webby Awards for Best Documentary Podcast, the Medal of Distinction from Barnard College, and numerous awards from the Native American Journalist Association. In 2016, she was recognized by the National Center for American Indian Enterprise Development for her work to support survivors and advocate for policy change to address the crisis of violence against Native women. Rebecca lives in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, where she also works on language revitalization. Her talk, I just worked on the pronunciation too, so I feel like I didn't quite get it there, but close, maybe. So her talk tonight is titled Changing the Narrative, Native Indigenous Representation in the News Media. It's going to be structured as an interview. Ms. Nagle is going to start with a few remarks, then I'm going to ask her questions for the remainder of tonight's event, including questions that some CSUB students have submitted prior to the event. We're not taking live questions from the audience tonight. So please join me in welcoming Ms. Nagle to CSUB.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you all so much for having me. I really, really appreciate it. And I appreciate you guys doing this hybrid event. I'm having some long COVID symptoms that have made it difficult to travel, which is also why I'm in like a rather dark room. So I hope you guys can see me. And it's also why I have like I'm not looking at the screen during the talk. So if I like get wildly off camera, please just let me know. But thank you for being accommodating and still letting me get this talk tonight. I'm really excited to connect with you. And thank you for the Eagle Heart Drum Group for such an amazing opening and welcome. Yeah, so what I wanted to talk about tonight is about the erasure of Indigenous people, whether it's in K through 12 curricula, in our news media, in pop culture, on television, on the radio. And I wanted to start with a specific example, and I'm wondering, this is actually kind of a tech question. Did you guys get the few slides I wanted to include?
I'm not sure they have them in the back, so maybe Rebecca, if you could just talk through what the slides are.
Okay.
that you had there.
Yeah. Okay, cool. All right. Well, all good. We'll chat it up. So I think especially I think a lot of the Native people in the room might remember this, and you might have also just seen it on the news. The example I was going to give is on it was election night 2020, Biden versus Trump, and we were starting to see tallies come in from different states. And CNN was showing the tallies for the state of Arizona. And, in these different exit polls, they're looking at how women voted, how Latinos voted, how different groups voted. And they had a breakdown of the voters in Arizona by race. But then instead of listing Native Americans, they had a category that they called something else. And it spurred a lot of really amazing memes. I think that Native Facebook had fun with that for days. My two favorites were Tim McGraw's Something Else Outlaw and Something Else in the Cupboard. But jokes aside, it was actually a really serious moment of erasure. Because if you looked at the Native vote in Arizona, which was a state that a lot of people didn't think would flip blue, but flipped blue in the 2020 election for the Electoral College, if you looked at a map of sort of the state and the precincts that went blue, they basically overlaid with tribal land. So on some precincts on reservations, the vote went for Biden by over 97%. And so in this critical state, in a critical election, the Native vote really mattered. But instead of reporting on that, CNN erased it. And I think what we see, and we're gonna, in the Q&A, talk about other examples and deal with this more directly, but, whether it's the health data, whether it's the census, whether it's just sort of news coverage of important issues, debate in Congress, when you turn on the TV, when you turn on the radio, it is very, very rare that Native people are represented. And so even just that something else category, it's really common for us to be put in kind of an other category in data and not counted at all. It's getting better, like we have Lily Gladstone and we have reservation dogs. But if you think about Native people being represented actually proportionate to our portion of the US population, we shouldn't just have one Oscar nominee a generation. It should be something where we have Oscar nominees every year, like 1 out of every 50 people who are nominated for the Oscars should be Native. And so we're still at this place where it's very rare for us to be represented and for our full stories to be told. And we'll get into this more, but what a lot of people have seen, especially this researcher named Dr. Stephanie Freiberg, is that this creates this really deep-seated stereotype about Native Americans in the American psyche because average US people, citizens, aren't seeing living, breathing, contemporary, real Native people. They think that we don't exist or that we're somehow less real or that we're somehow less human. And these stereotypes, I think, are a real barrier towards, policy change and towards the type of laws that tribes and tribal citizens need. So that's my opening spiel. Like I said, I just, so much gratitude for you guys being willing to accommodate me while I'm going through this long COVID stuff. And I wish I could be there in person. I really like to meet people and, have that face to face. But I'm really glad that I could still be in community with you guys and still connect, and excited to hear your questions and to, start to build those relationships, even though it's, over some more distance.
Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, we're really glad that you're able to join us tonight. And, we're all figuring out different types of ways of doing events in this kind of way. I'm looking down at the podium here because I have a screen on the podium, so I can see you here, and the audience can see you up on the big screen in the theater too. So yeah, as you mentioned, some of the other sorts of things that we want to talk about with erasure tonight and thinking about. You've talked about a number of ways where that's occurred for Native peoples in the United States, and thinking about the pandemic is one example of that. The census is another. If you would talk a bit more about what erasures looked like in those situations.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I don't know if you guys can kind of rewind your mind back to the early months of 2020. You might not want to. It was a really stressful time for a lot of us. But a few months into the pandemic, there started being a much needed and important national conversation about the disproportionate impacts that COVID was having in communities of color. And people started thinking about policies and ways to, allocate resources so that disparity in who was being hospitalized and who was dying wouldn't disproportionately impact communities of color. And in that initial push of that conversation, Native communities were mostly left out because before we were left out of the national conversation, we were actually completely left out of the data. And so I did a piece for The Guardian that I believe it was published that April. And what I did is I called up state health departments, I looked at what they were publishing online, and of all the states in the United States who were publishing COVID data of infection rates, hospitalization, and death rates by race, half of all US states were putting Native people in the other category. And so there wasn't a category for Native Americans. There was just this catch-all of other. Another place that was doing that at the time was LA, which I'm sure, you guys in Bakersfield know that Southern California area has a really big urban Native population. And so, we will probably never know the full toll of COVID within our community because a lot of that data was never gathered. And that's not a problem that's just specific to COVID. That happens to, Native people in studies across the board, and even just sort of on the patient level. So there was one study that looked at Native people in our personal medical records and found that over half of us are put in the wrong racial category, and that this was even happening on birth and death certificates. So people's birth and death certificates were recording them as the wrong race. And so again, I think that's that deep-seated erasure of people not really thinking about Native Americans as existing, as being part of our communities, even looking at a Native person and treating a Native person not being able to see Native people as real. There are similar problems with the census. So one of the reasons the US Census is really important is because it allocates a lot of federal funding, because there are a lot of federal programs where, there's funding for everything from, schools to highways or whatever, and that it's dispersed according to population, so areas that have more people in them get more funding. The other thing that's really important is electoral representative, both in local politics, local boards, local city councils, state representatives, but then also Congress. And so, every time people are redrawing those maps and redistricting, they're looking at how many people live in an area. And so, being counted in the census is both resources for communities, and then is also very concretely tied to political power. And Native people, especially Native people living on tribal land, are chronically undercounted in the US Census. And so in 2010, the estimate, and a lot of people that I talked to who do this work actually thought that it was a lot higher, was that 1 in 7 Native people living on tribal land weren't counted. And so, that is an undercounting of that leads directly again to resources for our communities and political power. And I think we're going to, in the next few questions, start to talk about TV and film, but those are some very concrete ways, whether it's in the data, in public policy, you know, in these concrete ways where Native people are being erased and we're not being counted.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, providing segue into the next question here, we're thinking about erasure and thinking about representation. And one thing that you've talked about, it's not just, you know, representation that matters, it's the type of representation too. And so think about some of the work that you've done. So when Native people are represented on TV or in films, I mean, so what are the most common types of representation that we see, and why does that matter?
Yeah, so I think the most common representation we see of Native people is actually nothing, you know? So the most common thing that we see is nothing at all. There's an amazing researcher, she's a sociologist. Her name is Dr. Stephanie Freiberg. She's Tulalip, and she's done some studies that have put some really concrete numbers to this. So it's a little dated, but she did a study where she looked at the 2,336 characters on the 345 most popular television shows from 1987 to 2007. So it's like 2 decades of TV, over 3,000 characters. And of all of those TV characters, only three were Native American. Another study she did that I think sort of illustrates the flip side of that coin is that she looked at the Google image search results for Native American and American Indian, and over 90% of the images, so 9 out of 10 of the images, were of Native Americans before the year 1900. So I would say the short version of our representation is that we're almost never represented. And then when we are, it's this romanticized, historicized past, which again leads to this notion that there aren't real contemporary living Native people. And that's, you know, the stereotype that we're fighting. I think a couple other things that's important to talk about, like, especially if we want to talk about just like film and TV. One thing that we see a lot in film and TV is that the Native characters and the Native story, even if it's a film that's like really about Native people and Native subjects, still somehow the main characters are white and the Native people are really serving in service, you know, to that white protagonist, and are really a vehicle for the white protagonist's journey, rather than being the main center of attention. And then another thing that we see in film and television a lot is that when Native women, because I think the erasure of all Native people is harmful, but I think especially in film and television, there's an even narrower window that Native women are represented in, and that's almost always a victim of violence. And so, you know, a lot of the times when we see Native women in film and television, they're being victimized, and we're not seeing Native women, you know, just get to live their lives. I think a really good example of like both of those things together is the movie Wind River by Taylor Sheridan, who has like now built a whole like very successful TV career of Yellowstone, of like popping like white people into Native spaces and like building a world out of that. But in Wind River, it's all about like solving the sexual assault and murder of this Native woman. And literally the only time we see her is the scene leading up to her assault, and then the very violent scene of her being assaulted. And then it's this sort of like white FBI agent that like swoops in and like solves the murder, which also is something that, you know, doesn't often happen because there's like, you know, not enough police response to those things in real life. But I think you see that, you know, where the main character is this white FBI agent, and the Native woman that the entire story is built around, we only see her being victimized. We don't get to see her live her life. Yeah, so those are some of the representation problems we have. And of course, we'll get into this. Of course, like Native filmmakers and directors and actresses and actors and are pushing back against that. And we're starting to see some great examples of things that do not fall into those problematic tropes.
Thank you so much. I think, we'll keep talking about the issue of representation, and I want to come back to, so as a journalist, I specifically want to ask you about journalism here and how representation and how to kind of address underrepresentation when it comes to journalism. So in addition to your fantastic podcast, This Land, if you haven't heard it yet, you need to go out and listen to This Land. But you've written a number of essays. I talked about that before, national outlets like the Washington Post, USA Today. I'm wondering if you could talk about potential limits of different types of media for addressing underrepresentation. So podcasts seem like they've opened space for some new voices to be heard. But podcasts, it's also changing, it's sort of becoming large companies taking over sort of podcasts as well. So I wonder if you could think as a journalist in sort of ways that you've written and through your podcast, what kind of potential limits of addressing that, different ways that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as a journalist, I save like my most heated ire for my profession. I get like really mad at how non-native outlets cover native issues. And for me as a journalist, I think of it not as a diversity problem, but as a journalist problem, because I feel like that our communities are getting from large national outlets don't meet the standards of journalism, and just going through it, all the things that these outlets pride themselves on, they haven't invested in our communities. And so they're not doing that when it comes to reporting on our communities. One, the coverage is not timely. And so an issue will be percolating and pertinent in our communities for months before non-native media covers it. I think a really good example of that is Standing Rock, which had been covered by, outlets like ICT or Indians.com for almost like 6 months before it sort of broke the barrier and more into the mainstream. Oftentimes there's actually like factual discrepancies or things that are misleading, I think often from a lack of basic understanding. Sometimes I say, what will people believe without proof? And I think because there's so little basic knowledge, and more like civic knowledge around what a federally recognized tribe is, how tribal governments function, how criminal jurisdiction works on a reservation, these things that are honestly kind of basic, but a lot of journalists that are coming in to report on these stories don't know how those things work, and so can report stuff that really is we saw that in Oklahoma. We had a case that affirmed first Muskogee's Muskogee Nation's reservation, and then subsequently I think now it's up to 8 other reservations in eastern Oklahoma, including my tribe's reservation. About 40% of the land in Oklahoma is now reservation land. And, you had the Washington Post, you had the Wall Street Journal, we had local media reporting that basically the jailhouse doors had swung free and all these criminals were going free. And it didn't take a lot of legwork to show that those stories weren't true. And it also like having a basic understanding of like what crimes shifted to federal prosecutors, what crime shifted to tribal prosecutors, was to see what was actually happening on the ground. But I think because people just don't know enough about tribes, they don't know how to do that basic reporting. And so, like I said, to me, I think of it as a journalism problem instead of a diversity problem. And I think what we really need for our communities to have accurate reporting is for non-native media to invest the same kind of things where they're going to have like a science reporter and have more science reporting during a global pandemic, or more science reporting during climate change and climate catastrophe. And now a lot of outlets have a climate desk where they didn't have that 20 years ago. I think we need to see that kind of investment in our communities to just get accurate and adequate representation. And I'd also say there's a lot of native outlets. I mentioned ICT, Native News Online, Indians.com, and then of course a robust network of tribal newspapers where native journalists are doing that work and reporting for our communities ourselves, which I think is a really important part of that ecosystem. So Yeah, no, I think it's a really important question. I mean, I think that, unfortunately, this this lack of good information and good coverage does then really shape the national debates. And so that's something that I'm hoping will also get better. Maybe maybe journalism can kind of ride the coattails of Hollywood right now and get some better representation in sort of the news sphere as well.
Well, you're certainly doing your part in making that change. So, I think thinking about this and thinking about journalism and the kind of own your own take in the way that you do stories that you have. So, I was thinking about this, and so there's many different reasons why representation matters and why underrepresentation is a problem. And there's many important reasons why representation matters, of thinking about like possibilities for people themselves. It's the kind of idea of thinking about like, if you can see it, you can be it. Thinking about representation as providing communities of support, thinking about many different things. In your work, Rebecca, you've I think emphasized a kind of concrete sort of impact of thinking about that underrepresentation, erasure. You draw these lines to like concrete and these different Supreme Court decisions that have resulted from of thinking about underrepresentation and erasure. So I wonder if you can give a few maybe more of thinking about examples of how erasures had concrete impacts on policies for Native people, and if you could say a bit about too, like that kind of orientation, that what led you to focus on the kind of policy legal impacts of erasure.
Yeah. Well, maybe I can start by just extrapolating on what I was talking about a little bit
Yeah.
beforehand. So, we had that Supreme Court case that affirmed Muskogee Creek Nation's reservation, and then, a little bit less than half of the land in Oklahoma became reservation land. And that meant the state lost the power to prosecute crimes where either the victim or the perpetrator was Native. And depending on the crime, that jurisdiction shifted to either the tribe or the federal government. Well, our governor started going around and saying that 76,000 old convictions would be overturned and that people were being released from jail, that, basically there was chaos, that police couldn't do their job, that like all of this horrible stuff was happening. And they actually went to the Supreme Court and were trying to get the Supreme Court to overturn the decision in which it affirmed the reservation. And that 76,000 number was actually repeated by the Washington Post. They attributed it to Oklahoma, but they included it in a report about how, it's complete dysfunctional chaos in Oklahoma. And just like that number, like just taking that number into context, it was about 60 times the number of Native people who were incarcerated, whose crimes had happened in that area. It was like 20 times what the state had said just a few years ago, and it was 3 times the entire prison population in Oklahoma. So it was like from Mars. Like there's no way that was true. But prominent outlets kept repeating it. And what the Supreme Court ended up doing, the Supreme Court didn't entertain Oklahoma's wish to reverse the reservation argument entirely, but they did do this other thing that Oklahoma was asking, which it gave the state of Oklahoma more power to prosecute crimes on tribal land, specifically over crimes where the victim is Native, but the perpetrator is non-Native. And that didn't just apply to Oklahoma, it applied to like every state. And like you guys in California, you might kind of know this because you guys are a PL 280 state. And like we already know from PL 280 states, like where states share jurisdiction, it is not helped tribes and tribal communities. And so there was basically Oklahoma almost like a disinformation campaign, put out all of this bogus info, and the Supreme Court ate it up, and the Supreme Court in their decision, reshaping the landscape of criminal jurisdiction on every reservation in the United States, cited this idea of lawlessness and criminals walking free. And so I think that it has extremely concrete impacts on laws and policies that shape people's lives and what it's like to live on tribal land, what power our governments have. And I really think if you look at our history as Indigenous people, I think every wave of policy that has harmed us has been excused by lies. Allotment was supposed to help us, pull ourselves out of poverty and make us better capitalists. Boarding schools were supposed to help our children assimilate to white society and be more productive. Like that, lies have always, I think, accompanied these policies when we look back at history. And so I think there's a real battle over, I mean, the truth feels like too big of a word, but I think just accuracy about Native people, and that this inaccuracy and these lies at this present moment undermine our rights. But I think you can also see that historically. So thanks for asking. I hope that wasn't too in the weeds, but you kind of just saw these lies coming from the governor, it being repeated by the media, and then it being repeated in a harmful Supreme Court decision. And so that line, to me, in my mind, is pretty direct.
I think that was just the right amount of in the weeds. That was great. I mean, I think the kind of way in which connecting to these things that can seem very esoteric and making it the connection through your work and podcast is making it really clear to people the kind of impacts that it's having for erasure in these situations. So so this is exciting for me too. We have some questions from students that submitted it before this, and I want to turn to some of the student questions that we have now. These questions all come from students in Dr. Nora Cisneros' Introduction to Ethnic Studies class. And so the students in Dr. Cisneros' class submitted a few great questions. I want to send some of these to you. So this one is first from Aida. And so her question is that, and this is a topic that we started with, but thinking about, so I recall that Native American voters were ignored or erased in last election polls and media. We started talking about that tonight. I want to think that this won't happen anymore, but what are your thoughts on this? Do you think Native American representation in electoral politics will improve, and why or why not?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely, we talked about the example in Arizona of the important voting bloc of Native voters getting called something else by CNN. And so, I think that that's happening across the country. But I think you are seeing some places where there's been some really good organizing. So Native Organizers Alliance is doing a lot of really good work, especially in the Dakotas. And I think an important context to this conversation is that partially thanks to the Supreme Court, we've had a rollback of voting rights nationwide. And so, as you hear about things like voter ID laws or polling places not being opened, or there being one place to drop off your ballot in a big county, those states that are able to pass these laws are starting to pass laws that, don't have race explicitly written in them, but are written to target voters of color. And that's happened to Native voters. There was a law in North Dakota that said, for you to register to vote, you have to have an address that's not a PO box, but many people who live in, rather rural tribal communities, that's how they have a PO box. And so, so I think it's really important for us to see at this time where we're working, again, sort of just that representation being connected to the policy of, while we're working on thinking about, the electoral power of Native voters, for politicians to pay attention to Native voters, to consider us an important voting bloc, that we also make sure that our communities still have access to the polls. And so that looks like, where are polling locations, what are the kind of ID laws and things like that. But yeah, that's a really good question.
Okay, and the next question is from Anthony. And so this one along the same lines. So the question from Anthony is, we're only a few months away from presidential elections. I'm wondering if you can share some of the topics that are very important to Indigenous communities for this election.
Yeah, I don't know that I can pretend to speak for what's important to Indigenous communities. we're very diverse, and a lot of those issues are regional or specific to different tribes. But I think a couple policy issues that I've heard a lot of people talk about that I think would make a really big difference. One is how Indian Health Services, or IHS, is funded. So for people who don't know, Indian Health Services is one of the oldest federally run health programs in the United States. And it is how many Native people access healthcare. So, like when I go get my teeth cleaned or get my checkup or go to the emergency room, I go to like my tribe's hospital here in Tahlequah and their clinic. And that's not a handout from the government. You know, it's actually a treaty obligation. So in exchange for land, often we were promised things in return. And a lot of times that was also that we would be taken care of by the federal government, since our ways of life were being disrupted. But IHS is not funded like the way that Medicare is funded, where it's Medicare is oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the word. Sorry, but it's basically it's funded to where as many people who need Medicare get Medicare. And IHS is discretional funding. And so instead of saying, okay, this is how many patients IHS has, this is how many people need services, this is the cost of running this healthcare system, and this is how we're going to fund it. Instead, Congress says, this is how much money you have, figure it out. And so it's a system that's chronically underfunded. And, you know, we saw some of the ravages of that with COVID-19. And so I think both from a public health standpoint, but also just from a treaty obligation standpoint, the way IHS is funded needs to change. The other thing that people have talked about as a policy priority, which I was excited to see on some of the more progressive presidential candidates in the 2020 election, I thought it on some of their policy agenda. So it's starting to be talked about in that way, is what people call an Oliphant fix. And so I kind of hinted at this before, but we have a crisis of violence on reservations. And that crisis was created in large part by the Supreme Court, which ruled in 1978 in a case called Oliphant that tribes cannot prosecute non-Native people who commit crimes on their land. So that means if you're not Native, if you're not a citizen of a tribe, you can go on a tribal land, you can steal a pack of gum, you can break the speed limit, you can murder somebody, and the tribe can't prosecute you. And so what we've seen is, while there has actually been a downtrend in violent crime across the United States, in those same decades, it skyrocketed in tribal communities. And what's happened in the last couple reauthorizations of the Violence Against Women Act is that some of that tribal jurisdiction has been restored over very specific crimes like domestic violence, sexual assault, sex trafficking, some child abuse, and some crimes that are connected to those crimes. So like if an abuser intimidates a witness, they can be prosecuted for that too. But what we need is sort of a full fix instead of this patchwork. And so those are a couple policy things that I think have a really big impact on tribal communities, on people's lived experiences, that I've heard talked about, but I don't pretend to know that or speak, you know, that that's the priority for everybody.
Thank you. Okay, so this next question is from Myra. So she writes, I have to admit, I didn't learn much about Indigenous peoples until I got to college. I don't think I read anything written by an Indigenous author until I took ethnic studies at CSUB. It's a good plug for ethnic studies at CSUB. Representation of Native people in books, shows, movies, also an issue. I deeply enjoyed and felt so much watching Reservation Dogs. My question is, how can we demand more representation of Native peoples on all those levels in books, movies, and music, is what Myra writes.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. You know, one of the things I wanted to say is that I think I meet a lot of people who are like, oh my gosh, I never knew XYZ, or I never heard about this. And I think it's really helpful for us, because I think a lot of times we we're just like in a society, I think it's capitalism, but you know, maybe there's a different root cause where we sort of put everything on the individual instead of thinking about it as collectively or as systems. And so for me, I think when I meet people who don't, you know, have never heard about a certain Native law or really don't know that much, it's not an individual failing. Like it's not that you failed, but it's that it's a whole system of erasure. And so, you know, one example is, you know, in K through 12 education, you know, there's these state standard curriculums of what is taught. And in those standards, what is taught of Native history, 90% is before the year 1900. So basically, in like public education in the United States, like we stop existing. Like 1890 happens and we fall off a cliff. And like, you know, everything that happens from 1900 to the present moment, people don't know about. And it's a systemic problem. And I think, you know, representation, you know, helps push back against that. So there's some, you know, you mentioned reservation dogs. It's a really exciting moment. I think, you know, I hope we'll see that reservation dogs helps chart a new path for people to see that, you know, Native stories told by Native people are actually better than this sort of like, you know, dances with wolves, like reiteration. You know, I feel like we've had like 15 dances of wolves of like a white person like finding themselves. And so it's like actually reservation dogs is more interesting and is more entertaining. And so hopefully we can get more of that. A couple of suggestions. If people really liked Lily Gladstone, I think they just got distribution for this film, but she was in an independent film called Fancy Dance that she stars in, and it's an amazing film. So keep your eyes peeled for that when that's going to come out. And if people are really into Echo, Sydney Freeland, who's the Navajo director who directed, who's directing that, I think it's a Disney series, has a film that she made herself called Drunktown's Finest. That's really, really good. Yeah, there's some books that I would recommend. Ned Blackhawk just won the National Book Award. He's a historian at Yale, and he just won the National Book Award for Rediscovering America. That's a really great book. If you're into novels, Louise Erdrich, I mean, she's extremely famous and doesn't need me to plug her, but she's my favorite writer. So if you're into novels, those things are great. I have a book that's coming out in September. It's called By the Fire We Carry, if you want to check it out. And so I think definitely, like, you know, one of the things I tell people is like, wherever you get your information, just like add Native voices to that. So if it's Twitter, if it's TikTok, if it's podcast, just like mix in Native voices to what you're already consuming. But I also think that we have to be aware, like, of the limits to our powers as consumers when it comes to really changing these big systems. And I think one of the really exciting places where people are really starting to make inroads is in this idea of curriculum, both like at the college level and at the like K through 12 level. So, I mean, obviously on the flip side, we're in a horrible fight over what can and will be taught in our schools. But some tribal communities, specifically in like the Pacific Northwest, have been doing some really cool things around trying to change like state standard curriculum to get more Native stuff in there and more accurate Native stuff in there. And so whether it's at your university or on a local level or on a state level, I think that that's a really, really good place to start and to think about changing these systems. So yeah, thank you for that. That's a great question.
Well, thank you for that list of recommendations too. I'm up here, I'm like, I need my pen, write things down, but this is a good reminder. We're recording this too. So you can go to the Kegley Institute YouTube page after this. We'll put it up there. You can go back and check out the recommendations Rebecca's got here. Okay, it's just a few more questions. And so next question they have, and I want to make sure ask this one, it relates to the second season of your podcast. So this is from Daisy, and Daisy writes, my question's about ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act. Can you explain a bit more by why ICWA was passed decades ago and where it stands now? I mean, You
Yeah.
can listen to the whole season of the podcast, think about this. So I guess the short version of that.
Yeah, yeah. So the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA for short, was passed in 1978 after a big national study had found that 1 in 3, so a third of all Native children, had been removed from their families and their homes and their tribal communities. And most of those children were living with white families. And so it was both a federal policy to take Native children out of their homes and put them with white families. And then what was also happening was on the state level is that state social workers had a lot of bias towards Indigenous families, and would see a child being raised by a grandma instead of their biological parents and call that abandonment, or just take children because their families were poor. And so it's ICWA is a law that's basically like a set of guardrails so that when a child is either in the foster care system or in a private adoption proceeding, it is harder, not impossible, harder to separate that child from their family and from their tribe. And so it does things like prioritizing placing the child with another family member, or if the child lives on the reservation, that family custody case would go through tribal court. What happened was, starting in the mid 2010s, a group of special interests that included some like far right legal advocacy groups, private adoption attorneys, and some high powered corporate lawyers got together and decided that they wanted to try and overturn ICWA. And they sort of crafted this narrative that, again, like media narratives really feeding into like policy and court decisions, but they crafted this very bogus narrative that ICWA was harming children, that it was racial discrimination, that it wasn't fair to Native children. And they managed to get a case all the way to the Supreme Court. And it was very scary for tribes and tribal communities because, of course, like our children and like keeping our children in our communities and protecting our families was at stake. That because of the specific arguments that they were making, the other thing that was at stake was like all of federal Indian law and the future of tribal sovereignty, because they were making these really like strategic legal arguments that sort of struck at the heart of tribal sovereignty. And the good news to this story is that they lost, and they lost hard. I think the opinion was 7-2, and basically told them to get lost. And so I think it'll take some time to see if they give up, like this was the case that was probably like the most likely to, accomplish what they were trying, or if they, regroup and try it again. So I think that, ICWA's been under a serious concerted attack for a decade. People who are in the trenches working on it, were saying things like it's just a matter of time before a case gets to the Supreme Court. So it's good news that this case was not one that that overturned the statute or imperiled tribal sovereignty while doing that.
Thank you. And like I said, you check out the second season of the podcast, who's doing as this was leading up to this decision. And then you did another episode after the decision was released about it. So you can hear more detail about that with their podcast. We have time for just one last question here. So this last question is from Emma. And Emma asks, can you share a bit about your own experiences as a college student? Do you have any advice for current students interested in careers that make a difference? I'm the first in my family to attend a university, and I want to make a difference just like you are doing. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's such a great question. I was thinking about it. Sometimes like I feel hesitant to give people advice because I feel like so much advice is this what it comes down to is this idea of like, oh, you should be doing something different, or you should be doing something more. And it sounds like you're doing great. It sounds like it's such a big accomplishment to just get into college and to get through college. It's so much work. And so part of the advice I would give you is just like, good job, you're doing enough, And I would say, yeah, I was thinking about this question and I was like, what did I do in college that I feel like really helped me after college? Um, and I think it was some of the personal relationships that I had with some of the faculty at my school. And so I got really close with like a handful of professors, and they really mentored me, helped me. And like those first few years after college, like I would like house sit for one and like cat sit for another, and like do like odd jobs around their house. But also just like I think in those first few years after college, when I was like really trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my career, they were an ear for me, and they just, like are still people I'm in touch with and are like invested in like where I'm at and how I'm doing. And I feel like I got as much, if not more, from those sort of like out of classroom relationships and those mentors than I did just like what I learned from them in class. And so that would be my advice, is that if there are those relationships and those mentors like available to you, that's just what really, really helped me. Yeah, and I think, in terms of like jobs and after college, I graduated in 2008, which was at like it was like right after the financial crisis. And so it was actually like a pretty hard time to find a job, because sort of as a less experienced person entering the workforce, a bunch of people had just been laid off. So I was sort of competing with people who had like a lot more experience for me for like some of jobs that, maybe a few years before, more experienced people wouldn't have applied for. And so it's like I strung it together for a good long while, sort of like doing odd jobs and making it work. And I think that like like jobs and the stability of, things that used to be a stable income, I think are, a lot of that stuff is bottoming out. And so I think it can be hard to find those career paths. So I guess I just don't want to give advice where it's like it's not recognizing like those things that are hard about it, especially when it comes to like paying the bills and all that stuff. But because journalism wasn't my first career and it's not what I went to school for. And so when I was trying to kind of like get my foot in the door and just like get started in it, again, it was kind of relationships. And so they didn't pay great, but like the first people who kind of just like gave me a shot and gave me a space to write were, sites like ICT and editors like Mark Trehan or like Graham Brewer at High Country News. And then also it was back at the time when there was a lot of like feminist blogs or like feminists. So there was like Everyday Feminism or like Bitch Media. I think Bitch Media is still around. And so those were some of the first platforms where I got a voice, and sort of and some other Native journalists were like really helpful at kind of trying to give me a chance or sort of help me network. And so yeah, I guess my advice would just be ask for help, but also just to utilize those relationships, because there are a lot of people who want to help you out, but also just congrats on being in college, and getting here. I know it was like a lot of work, and so just appreciate also just like all that you have done so far.
All right. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Please join me giving her another round of applause here.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, for being flexible with the hybrid event. I really wish I could be there in person, but it's been so nice to hear the drum group, to get these amazing questions from students. So I'm just so honored and grateful that you all thought of me and were willing to include me over Zoom. So thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank you all for coming tonight, and join us on Zoom too. Many people on Zoom tonight too. And I hope to see you at a future Kegley Institute event. So thank you. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.